Hello and welcome to the sixth segment of the Cyber Kill Chain brought to you by Club A. This sixth segment is about the command and control phase of the Cyber Kill Chain. So again, as we've discussed in the previous phases, there's 7 phases to Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain: recon, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and actions on objectives. Again, just a recap of the cyber kill chain, just brief. And the cyber kill chain is designed to represent the attack lifecycle. So what takes an attacker from no access to, having completely accomplished their tasks and left the system. So just boiling that down again, it's recon, weaponization. So in the recon, the attacker will gather intel on the victim network and devices. The weaponization phase includes the victim or the attacker taking those the collected data and boiling it down to the most valuable information regarding vulnerable services or attack vectors, and then turning that into an actual attack path, planning it out. And then delivery would be the delivery of payloads or different attack mechanisms to the attack targets. Exploitation would be the actual execution of those payloads, and execution of the malicious downloads if it was some kind of a phishing campaign. And then installation is post-compromise, so the attackers made it into the network. They usually have just some kind of a simple shell. Installation would be it's what we covered last week, and it's the more advanced phase of establishing a strong foothold on the system and guaranteeing persistence on that system. So then command and control, that's today's phase. It's specifically discussing the more complex parts of establishing that persistent foothold. It's again, when we look at the individual components of the phases themselves, the phases start to blur together a little bit. Last week we talked about how the installation occurs, and this week we're talking more about the actual command and control aspect of the attack itself, because typically attackers, when they gain access, they're going to install their own rootkits or command and control agents so that the victim machine can reach back to a command and control server. It can be a very simple just callback to one IP address, or it can be as complex as domain generation algorithms, where thousands of domains are constantly being registered and unregistered, and you may not ever know which one of them is actually the command and control server. We'll talk more about that too as we get further into today's presentation. So, command and control. The objectives of the command and control phase is to deploy the C2 server. So that's what the victim machines are going to call back to, is the command and control server. It's the central hub. It's the protected network that is completely controlled by the attacker. And it's what all of the infected computers, wherever they are, infected devices, I should say, wherever they are calling back to. It's that central brain that controls the operation. It's where the attacker sends commands from. It's where the attacker collects data, collects intel, all that kind of stuff. So that's the first objective, is to establish that server. Usually, before the attack life cycle's even started, the attacker already has a C2 server made, but for the sake of the presentation, we're talking about it as the phase objective. Then from there, once they're on that system on the victim device, they need to establish a covert channel back and forth. It's a two-way communication between the victim and the C2 server. So it's not as simple as it sounds. How would these two talk back and forth? Well, we're going to talk more about that in this presentation. So first, we're going to talk about that C2 server, that central hub for the victim or zombies to talk to. What what is that server, right? Sometimes the command and control server is actually a previously compromised device or a computer or system of computers that the attacker has gained control of and is setting up a command and control server on. So sometimes what you might see is, let's say an attacker does a phishing campaign, gains control of a small network of machines. The attacker will then use that as the hub so that the attacker's own stuff isn't compromised. And if let's say that C2 server does get taken down or gets seized by the authorities, the attacker can easily just step back and forget about it. It's disposable, right? So that's one thing that happens sometimes. Sometimes you see the hub in the cloud, like they'll steal someone's Azure or their AWS credentials, and they'll start building their own network within this compromised cloud portal, basically. So you'll see that too. From there, the attacker will establish secure. Actually, we might talk about this next, but you know, so I have some more info there too. The more info button, that's a link to more sources on the different protocols that are used to tunnel malicious traffic out and in. So I'll just kind of talk about that too before I proceed to the next slide. So the communications back and forth between the agent and the server are usually, you know, you don't just do it over like, I don't know, it actually could happen any number of ways, but typically what an attacker is going to do is use a protocol that is being used by pretty much everything else so that you can blend into typical traffic. I think we're going to talk about that later though. But so what you'll see is communications going back and forth between the C2 server and the agents through HTTPS or email protocol, or even sometimes a custom created protocol, which is not very usual. And then sometimes you'll see it done over unencrypted protocols, but protocols that aren't. HTTP would be monitored, but DNS is usually just totally unmonitored, depending on how the system configurations are set up by the network administrators. So continuing that, that central hub, that command and control server, is always listening. So it always, depending on the deployment of the command and control agents, the server itself is listening for those agents to reach out to it, the zombies to call back to the command and control server once they've been successfully deployed. That's called beaconing. That's a really common term in the cybersecurity industry, beaconing. So zombies will beacon back to command and control servers. That's actually beaconing behavior, something watched for pretty heavily in endpoint detection and response systems, intrusion detection systems, and sometimes more advanced antivirus systems will look for beaconing activity. Sometimes the communications between the zombies and the actual command and control server are separated through various proxies. You know, there's relays between so that the zombie will know to reach out to such and such server, but such and such server just relays that information to another relay, and so on and so forth, depending on how crazy these attackers are. And that's why it can be so hard to nail down these botnets, even if you know that these agents are part of a large botnet. And then it gets even more intense. Dynamic generation algorithms, they're specifically designed software flows so that these, instead of having a static list of unchanging IPs and domains for the agent to reach back to call back to, they'll actually follow an algorithm where a dynamically generated domain, the program will spit out a list of dynamically generated domains, and it could be tens to hundreds to thousands of different domains that it will try and call back to until one is successful. And therefore you can't just statically reverse engineer the code. You have to dynamically, you have to break down you have to watch the program run and watch for what it calls back to instead of just reverse engineering it. So it's an evasion technique, really. It's also a way to protect the command and control server. And the algorithm goes both ways. The C2 server itself will have dynamic host registration services set up, and then the agent will have callback algorithm. So it's like back and forth. They'll have matching components of that algorithm together. So it's actually nuts. There's huge frameworks out there that are available for command and control. You'll see things like Cobalt Strike, the Metasploit framework, Caldera, Covenant. These are all, not all of them are open source and free, but a bunch of these you can just download the source code online and set up your own C2 server and deploy agents just like that and start controlling computers no matter what the operating system is, no matter what kind of a device it is, right like that. So it's just crazy that these things are openly available. They're openly free to download right off GitHub. There's no, I mean, the strings attached to that and we're going to talk about this at the very end, the strings attached to that you're trusting these frameworks, right? But as you can see in the list here, Cobalt Strike is paid. You can't use that. I mean, there's a really, really boiled down version of it. I can't remember even what it's called. It's really old. It used to be on Kali Linux. I'm not sure if it is anymore. But Cobalt Strike is paid. It's advanced. And that is actually used by both white hat hackers and black hat hackers. So it's used by malicious and by the good guys and the bad guys. All of these are, basically. They're used by good guys and bad guys. And so that's kind of the double-edged sword to ethical hacking. Like, it's hard to be a hacker in the truest sense, and we get a lot of flack for that because these types of things just get put out there for free, and anyone can pick them up and start infecting everyone. But easier said than done, right? This is a whole career on itself. So you can see there it says huge list. It's a clickable link. I'm going to drop the PDF after this video. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can't just get this link from me. You'll have to be part of the club, and this is a university ethical hacking club, by the way. So if you're watching this and you're part of the Discord club, then you'll see the PDF dropped in the chat, and you'll be able to check out that huge list. There's probably 100 different frameworks and tool suites that can be used. So that's something I wanted to point out, that all these things are readily available. You can just pick it up and start working with it. Obviously, easier said than done. So common command and control framework features would, you can see in that screenshot there, I have a picture of the Cobalt Strike trial version that shows it looks like an infected host, and you're able to right-click, access, bypass the user authentication control or whatever that is, the Windows thing, dump the hashes, golden ticket, make token, run an imicats, spawn as, so you can spawn a shell as, pivot. So it's like it's got these automated actions, right? But then once you once you spawn a shell, you can do whatever you want with it. But then there's automated actions within the suite itself. And this is a trial version, so it doesn't show everything you can possibly do. But there's a lot of these command and control frameworks will be, they'll have a really nice GUI. A lot of the big ones will have a GUI and that kind of stuff. So it makes it really easy to start deploying these types of things. But you still have to know what you're doing before you can just start controlling a botnet, So basically, the C2s will offer a centralized overview of all the victim devices, whether it be GUI or command line interface. You'll be able to type in some kind of command and see all your victims, whether they're up, whether they're offline, when the last time they communicated was, show you all kinds of statistics on these machines, list them by operating system, list them by what privileges you have, whether or not you're just a regular user or if you're an administrator, or if you have root on that device, if it's Linux or Mac. So that type of a thing. Actually, I don't know if you can get root on Mac. Don't quote me on that. I haven't tried before. So another thing you can do on more advanced frameworks is start chaining together complex tasks. So you'd have a task that's automated. Well, on some of these more advanced frameworks, you can chain together these different tasks. So you could make, technically unlimited chains of attacks, all straight from a GUI interface and without the need to program it, and the computer would just run it. and let you know if it was successful or not. And then if it wasn't, you can just check why and fix whatever it is by running a temporary shell on the victim machine, and then run it again, and you're good to go, right? An example of an advanced chain attack. If you're curious where this comes from, you should look up the MITRE attack framework, specifically into TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures. These are entirely detailed there, and a lot of attacker behaviors are listed and categorized in the MITRE attack framework under the TTP section. So, yeah, you would, for example, of an attack chain, you would see, the initial compromise. The next task in the chain would be to escalate privileges. It would have an entire sublist of automated actions it would perform before it loops on to the next task in the chain, which would be, let's say, leave a ransom note on the desktop. The next task could be start encrypting the entire computer recursively. The next one would be lock out the keyboard, or lock out this or that, so that the user can't actually access anything, and that type of thing. So that's what you'd see. That would be an example of a ransomware chained attack. And again, disclaimer, we are not responsible for anything you do by telling you this type of stuff. This is all educational. We're intending to be cybersecurity professionals, so what you do with this information, you're entirely responsible for your own actions. But this is the type of technology that allows this to even happen. It gets easier and easier with the more advanced frameworks that you grab, and the more advanced ones are not free. You have to pay for them, so they're also wicked expensive, like $50,000 a year. So don't go thinking you can just go pay for it if you want to hack a buddy or something. And don't ever do that, by the way. So anyways, some of these frameworks can also generate dynamic, obfuscated agents to deploy on newly compromised machines. So what that means is the framework itself has like an agent that it uses that will beacon back to the command and control server. Well, sometimes those agents in their base form are reported on every antivirus service known to man. So the framework would allow you to dynamically generate or regenerate the agent in a way that the code itself is obfuscated from detection, and then it can get more and more complex, and that is that's under the topic of malware reverse engineering or malware detection and that kind of stuff, and that is a very fascinating subject, but is one that we are not covering. But essentially, the frameworks may even have, I've seen frameworks that have these features that allow you to dynamically generate and obfuscate your agents to deploy on the machines, and they work. It's crazy. Like, you put it on one and it gets picked up, then you rerun it under the obfuscation options, and then all of a sudden you can run it on that victim machine, no problem, and it's easy. So I included this slide, attack in less steps versus more steps, because this is kind of where, again, the kill chain's great because it's a great overview of the attack lifecycle, but sometimes it doesn't represent everything, because there are some cases where your attack lifecycle is only 4 steps, but then there's sometimes where it's 25 steps because the network is so much more complex and there's so many more additional steps you need to take. Like, how do you represent a successful phishing campaign versus a point-and-click Metasploit attack, like where you can do everything from 0 to hero? Well, it wouldn't be hero in this case, but 0 to compromise, 0 to actions on objectives, all through the Metasploit framework. Like, there's exploit, like the MSF console has an entire huge database of deployable payloads, and the framework itself automates so much of it that you don't even need to worry about it. It'll just do it all for you. With some of those, if in order to do a 0 to actions on objectives exploit through MSF console, you would need a machine that's been unpatched for 20 years, maybe 10 years, or it just has one really good vulnerability on it, and then you would just type in the IP address, the listening port, and then the target IP address or domain, and done. You got a reverse shell on that computer. Reverse shell meaning the victim is calling back. So you deploy it, the victim's runs the script, and then it calls back, giving you either a root shell or a user privileged shell on the victim machine. That's a reverse callback or a reverse shell. So sometimes you attack in less steps. Sometimes you have to attack in more steps because you have to really prepare an attack to get to the point where you can finally deploy advanced malware on that machine that allows you to perform command and control operations, basically. So again, that C2 agent, sometimes they're complex, sometimes they're simple, sometimes it's literally as simple as, just typing in, /bin/sh, specifically calling back to a certain IP address. Sometimes that's all the code is for your shell. But usually when it comes to a command and control agent, they're not that simple. They have much more, I want to call them components involved, where they have evasion techniques like detecting whether or not they're in a sandbox, or some kind of like detecting whether or not they're in a virtual machine, or detecting what the antivirus currently running is, or let's say it's staged malware where the first thing that gets deployed is a downloader, or and then the downloader downloads the code, and then the code is an unpacker, and it unpacks a payload from another remote server, and then from there it doesn't even, let's say it doesn't actually install a file on the computer, but it just loads it into the memory, and then from there, who knows, right? There's so many different ways the malware can operate, and this is where things get very nuanced. But the C2 agent's main purpose is to give the command and control server a foothold on that device that is, again, persistent, that will always be there upon reboot, and that is undetectable, and will also establish a secure tunnel under some protocol back to the command and control server. So we talked about that before, how it could be under DNS, could be under SSH, HTTPS, depends on what protocol they want to use. But something like HTTPS is what is commonly seen. DNS is commonly seen. SSH maybe not, because depending on what you're using, there may not be a reason for an SSH connection to be there. But HTTPS, that's internet, right? That's secure hypertext protocol. That's anyone browsing the internet's going to have a rapid HTTPS protocol communication going on their computer across the network all day, depending on how long they're browsing. And that happens at any time of the day. It happens even at night. So HTTPS is kind of genius to tunnel your traffic through, because you're visiting all kinds of IP addresses. You're doing all kinds of DNS resolves. You're doing all kinds of packet delivery back and forth. And let's say it's a big website or something like that. There's going to be lots of packets. So it makes sense for a command and control server to do HTTPS. And as well, one of the big things that needs to be mentioned about that is that, actually, I think we're going to talk about this on the next one. But yeah, exactly. We are talking about it, because the big reason for establishing that covert channel, like through HTTPS, is to keep the communications covert. HTTPS is, the S stands for secure, which means that the packets are being encrypted, which means that the sender and the receiver can lock and unlock that packet and view the contents. But anything in between can't. Things in between could potentially capture the packets, but they can't read them. They don't have the secrets necessary to read those packets, to view the contents, and they might not even have the context, even if they did, to view those contents. But so that's the whole idea behind establishing that covert channel. Intrusion detection systems, endpoint detection and response, antivirus systems, not as much antivirus, but definitely IDS and EDR. Those are heavily designed for finding those kinds of covert communications. But it's hard, because you can't just open up someone's HTTPS session. You need captured tokens for that type of a thing. And sometimes there's no way to do that. And then there's privacy laws, right? Like, the network administrator might not be able to invade employees' privacy like that and that kind of stuff. So attackers will use these types of, I want to say, network climates to their advantage. They'll tunnel their communications through a protocol that's encrypted and essential or unmonitored like DNS. And sometimes it is monitored, but there's the pros the pros and cons to monitoring everything. You can't monitor everything, right? You have to be selective about what you monitor because too much data requires more resources, takes up the IT budget, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just not as simple as checking everything. And if DNS is happening 100,000 times a day, it generates 10 gigabytes of data across the whole network. Well, where are you going to store that, right? So that's the whole idea. And then the whole idea of establishing that covert tunnel is to reduce the chance of inspection, which leads to detection and gets you kicked out and potentially caught, depending on if you're. And we're all white hat hackers here, so we're not getting caught, or we're not doing anything illegal. So if we get caught, we just have to let them know we're part of the pen testing team or something like that. So yeah. And then finally, because we talked about these frameworks, right? And if you're part of the club and you get all those links to the huge list of frameworks that you can check out, you have to remember that you're taking a huge risk by downloading someone else's malware from the internet, because that's what this is, right? The framework is malware from the ground up. That's, when you download it on a system that has antivirus, your antivirus is going to flag it and try and quarantine it and get rid of it because it thinks it's malware, because that's what it's been reported as a million times. So you're taking a risk, right? Especially I want to say less with the paid stuff because there's a reason why it's paid stuff. But with the free stuff, you got to remember anything that's free is free because you're the product, right? Not because the product, like, I'm butchering it, but that's essentially what it boils down to is when something is free, it's because you're the product, not the thing you're using. It's collecting your data, or it's going to hijack your browser session to mine Bitcoin or whatever it is, right? So that in some way, anything that's free, they're benefiting from you using it. And you always have to remember that, anything that's free. So, yeah, be careful. Trust no one, trust nothing. If you're really suspicious about it, download a virtual machine and install the framework on the virtual machine and then start messing with it, because then at least it's virtualized, right? And that's basically it. So to wrap it up, this was the 6th segment of the cyber kill chain, command and control. Essentially, this is all how botnets are formed, and it's also one of the most important phases of the cyber kill chain, but so is every other phase. And there it is. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat on Discord, and thanks for checking out the video.